All right, welcome to part 2 of legal research for non-lawyers. Here we are going to turn to primary sources of law. Again, I realize that this lecture might be a little bit confusing, particularly at first. What I really want you to do is be able to come back to the lecture or use the printed lecture slides to help you with your legal research. So please consider this entire lecture and its slides to basically be a user manual for how to conduct legal research. So primary sources of law are the types of law that come directly from a branch of government. So for instance, statutes from the legislative branch, regulations and agency decisions from the executive branch, and case law from the judicial branch. Now, these are not the only primary sources of law. The US Constitution and state constitutions are primary sources, so are executive orders, but for the most part, when we're dealing with primary sources in this class, it's going to be statutes, regulations, and case law. Okay, so when you are writing your memos for class or for your jobs, you're going to want to refer to the official compilations of laws. So those include the US Code, which is a compilation of federal statutes organized by title. Here, I don't mean alphabetical title like an encyclopedia. Instead, titles of the US Code are based on subject matter areas. So, for example, US Code Title 25 is Indians. It provides statutory authority for the US federal government to interact with Native American tribal governments. Title 33, Navigation and Navigable Waters, as we saw in part 1 of the lecture, contains the Clean Water Act. Title 43 is Public Lands. So you can actually go to the US Code and just browse all of the titles to see what they contain. The Code of Federal Regulations, which we normally call the CFR, it's like the US Code, but for federal agency regulations. It's organized pretty similarly to the US Code. The title names often match up, but not always. Now, the US Code is prepared, published, and updated annually by the Office of Law Revision Counsel within the US House of Representatives. The CFR is prepared, published, and updated annually by the Office of the Federal Register, which is part of our National Archives. Now, because the US Code and the CFR are updated annually, they're not going to contain the most recent laws and regulations, because those are not going to make it into the US Code or CFR until the next yearly update. Now, because regulations are much more numerous and nimble than statutes, the GPO, the Government Printing Office, does provide an electronic version of the CFR called the eCFR. It is updated daily for the most part. The eCFR is not official, but for our purposes, it's fine for you to use it. So for both the US Code and the CFR, the citation format is going to be the title number, the name of the compilation, so either USC or CFR, and a section number. CFR citations, they might refer to just a part of a title. So for instance, 6 CFR Part 13, or they might drill down to the section, 6 CFR Section 13.1. You have to use the section sign for the US Code citations, but not for CFR citations, although you certainly can. Now, the Federal Register, unlike the US Code and CFR, is not an annual compilation of laws and regulations. It is the official daily journal of the federal government, kind of like a daily diary. The Federal Register contains notices and other publications by federal agencies, and that includes proposed regulations, final regulations, notices of adjudications, and notices of changes to existing regulations. Because the Federal Register is published daily, the citation is longer, because you need to cite not only the volume and page number of the Federal Register, but also the date. So you can see the citation formats here on the screen. So the US Code and the CFR, they're divided into nice, tidy titles that are based on subject matter. That is not the case for judicial opinions, also called case law or court opinions or court rulings, and that's not the case for the administrative equivalent of judicial opinions, which are agency decisions. So rather than being codified, court decisions are compiled into books called reporters, and these reporters cover the decisions of certain courts, and they do so in chronological order. For federal court cases, the reporters that you will use most frequently are the U.S. Reports, which is the official reporter of the U.S. Supreme Court. That is shown by the designation U.S. And then also the Federal Reporter, which mostly reports on court cases decided by the U.S. Courts of Appeals. And that is shown by the designation F, F2D for second edition, or F3D, third edition, which is the current edition of the Federal Reporter. Your citation for court cases is always going to start with the names of the parties. So for instance, you see I've got Miranda versus Arizona, then the volume and page number of the reporter. For Supreme Court cases, the page number is followed by the year that the decision was handed down in parentheses. You only need the year because you already know that you're in U.S. Reports, and you already know that U.S. Reports only has U.S. Supreme Court opinions. For lower courts, your parenthetical information is also going to include the name of the court that decided the case. So now the U.S. Courts of Appeals are also called circuit courts. In the citation example that I have provided on the slide, Xiao versus USDA, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals decided that case in 1989, and you know that because in parentheses it says Second Circuit 1989. That particular case is found in volume 895 of the Federal Reporter second edition, and that case starts on page 1410. Administrative decision citations follow a similar format. So under that agency decision heading, I've provided examples of decisions that were made by the Comptroller General of the United States. In that citation, CPD simply stands for Comptroller General Procurement Decisions. These are decisions made when government contractors file disputes with the government, either bid protests or award protests. The Comptroller General also has decisions just of the Comptroller General. Those are marked as Comp Gen rather than CPD. These are the GAO's version of case law. They deal with topics like appropriations, also bid protests, and federal agency rulemaking. The GAO also issues reports generally upon request by Congress, has audits, surveys, investigations, it does evaluations of federal programs. So you'll find a variety of information under the GAO resources. There are also contract appeals boards. So there is the Armed Services Board of Contract Appeals, the ASBCA, and the Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, the CBCA. They handle disputes between agencies and their contractors that arise under the Federal Contract Disputes Act. Now, that act also permits parties to go to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, which is an administrative court, but it operates almost identically to an Article III federal court. So basically what we think of as a real court, quotation marks there, would be the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Various administrative agencies have their own offices of administrative law judges. These are known as ALJs. They handle administrative hearings, also called administrative adjudications. We're going to discuss these later in the course, but basically, if you lose your case before an ALJ or a Board of Contract Appeals, you can go ahead and appeal that loss up to a federal court. So as noted in part 1 of the lecture, once a bill becomes a law, it goes through quite a process before winding up in the US Code. During this process, the full text of the public law gets broken up into chunks that are slotted into the appropriate titles of the US Code. Now remember, for federal statutes, titles of the US Code are compilations of subject matter. So a single public law might impact multiple subjects. So for instance, maybe it impacts land use, and it also impacts Native Americans. So it will get broken up into pieces and placed into different parts of the US Code. What this means is that if you want to read the entirety of a statute as it was written by Congress, you need to read the public law. But if you just need to know how the law impacts your particular agency, the US Code is where you want to look. The US Code and the US Code Annotated, or the USCA, they're identical in terms of title and section, so the wording is going to be the same. The USCA has annotations. Those annotations are secondary sources, but they are very useful when you're performing legal research. Just remember, the USCA is not the official compilation. You've got to cite to the US Code. So when you are citing federal statutes, your primary official citation is the US Code. If that is not available for some reason, which could be just because it hasn't been placed into the US Code yet, use the public law number. If that's not available, you can go ahead and use the statutes at large citation, but really you should try to use the US Code or the public law. So here is sort of a breakdown of the general organization of the US Code. The title is the largest division divided by subject matter. Within each title, you've got chapters, subchapters, parts, sometimes subparts, and then sections. The chapters and parts are not always organized identically within the titles. Sometimes a chapter comes first, sometimes a part comes first. For our purposes, it doesn't matter. What matters is the proper citation, which is always going to be the title and section. Now, sections are technically the smallest division of the US Code, but sections can be broken down into paragraphs, subparagraphs, clauses, and subclauses. If you're citing to a law and say you need to cite to section 201, but it contains paragraphs A, B, and C, you've got to cite to that appropriate paragraph. If you are quoting directly from subparagraph A1, you need to cite to section 201A1, not just 201, not just 201A. You've got to drill all the way down. So I think that most or all of you are familiar with the basic structure of the US Code or your state's equivalent. But let's take a look at the structure using a non-legal example. So consider all of the public universities within the state of Colorado. In the example here that I've got on the screen, Title I is Colorado Public Universities. That gets broken down into chapters, each of which represents a specific public university. I organize these alphabetically. you'll see that Chapter 9 is the University of Colorado, Denver. Then we break down CU Denver further into subchapters that represent the colleges and schools within CU Denver. Again, I've done this alphabetically, so the School of Public Affairs is subchapter 8. Then SPA is broken down into parts. You'll see that part 1 is general provisions. That might be the structure of the School of Public Affairs and the admission process. The remaining parts divide it up into chunks such as the Criminal Justice Program, the Public Affairs Public Administration Program, concentrations and certificates, and leadership programs. All of those parts are further broken down into sections. You will see that our class fits under Part 2, Section 3, Criminal Justice Graduate Degrees, and also Part 3, Section 2, Public Administration Graduate Degrees. So hopefully by looking at this non-legal example, hopefully this is just a useful way for you to envision the structure of the US Code. All right, so if you're looking for federal statutes, you need to know where to find them. You can find the US Code on a variety of websites. In my opinion, the best and easiest to use is going to be Cornell University's Legal Information Institute, or LII. It allows for a variety of searches. You can browse by title, and it also contains an incredibly helpful table of popular names. So you might know the popular name of a law, but you might not know its official name or its location within the US Code. So the popular name table, it'll get you to where you need to go. So for instance, you'll be able to look up Clean Water Act. You will learn that it is actually named the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, and then you'll get a link to its location within the US Code. You can also use GPO. Occasionally, the GPO site will be a little bit more up-to-date than the Cornell site. So if you can't find a statute or a specific section on Cornell, go ahead and check the GPO site. Or if for some reason the Cornell site is down for maintenance, go ahead and check GPO. It contains the same expandable table of contents and the same general format as Cornell, but it can be really slow to open. So that is why I recommend the Cornell site. And here you go. Here is the Cornell Legal Information Institute's US Code site. Here you will see that it is a title listing of the US Code. These are those broad subject matter areas. And keep in mind, sometimes all of the laws that affect a specific agency will be located in a single title, but that's not always true. Some agencies are involved in multiple substantive areas, and so the statutes that impact them might be spread throughout multiple titles. Now, Cornell used to have a search option for title and section so that if you knew your US Code citation, you could just write it in. It's usually at the top of the homepage, but for whatever reason, it's not there right now. Hopefully, Cornell's going to bring it back. You will also see that I have highlighted the table of popular names, which we will get to in a moment. But for right now, let's say that you need to find the Administrative Procedure Act, and you're going to do that by browsing the titles. Well, as you see here, Title 5, Government Organization and Employees, yeah, that might be where you would find administrative procedures, so let's go ahead and click that. So you've browsed that title. You see that Title 5 is about the organization of the federal government. If you click on it, it brings up several parts. If you were to click on Part 1, there at the top left of the screen, you'll see it says the agencies generally. Okay, so click on that, and then it's going to bring up chapters, which is there sort of in the middle towards the right. you'll see that because I'm looking for the Administrative Procedure Act, Chapter 5, called Administrative Procedure, seems to be the natural choice. Now, usually the natural choice is also the correct choice, but just be aware that occasionally it's not, and you're gonna have to go back a step and sort of browse through more portions of the code. But fortunately for us, the APA is indeed located in Chapter 5 under Subchapter 2. Subchapter 2 is the entirety of the Administrative Procedure Act, for which the citation is 5 U.S.C. Section 551 and sequence. Okay, here is the Cornell US Code Table of Popular Names. You can get to it from the Cornell US Code homepage, which I had highlighted a few slides back, or you can link to it near the top right of the page. So, the Table of Popular Names is organized alphabetically by the popular names of various laws. If you want to find the text of the Clean Air Act or its citation, you would scroll over to the C's, and then I recommend using a Control F keyword search to search for Clean Air Act. You can see that I've done that on the screen, and the Clean Air Act and all of its amendments have come up. Now, the one non-intuitive aspect of the popular name table is that if you click on the actual popular name, that is not terribly helpful. It's going to take you to a classification table, which is good if you want to know how the public law was broken up and placed into the US Code, but it's not going to take you to the text of the statute. So instead, what you want to do is click on the US Code citation. And for the Clean Air Act, that is 42 U.S.C. Section 7401. You can see that I've got it highlighted in 2 red boxes there. So if you click on those, then you get taken right there. We are now at 42 U.S.C. Section 7401, the start of the Clean Air Act. Now, one really nice thing about Cornell's site, and it's not only on Cornell, other sites have it too, are the breadcrumbs. So the breadcrumbs are that string of information at the top, which lets you see exactly where you are in the US Code and how you got there. So let's say that you know the Clean Air Act is 42 U.S.C. 7401, but you're not quite sure how you got to it. You can actually see from US Code, you go to Title 42, Public Health and Welfare, you go to Chapter 85, Air Pollution Prevention and Control, and onward down the line until you actually get to the start of the Clean Air Act. So the reason that breadcrumbs are great is that you can use them to browse for other helpful sections and other helpful statutes. So for instance, if you want to see what else is in Part A, air quality and emission limitations, you just click it. And here you go. When you click Part A, you get the whole list of sections within Part A. So this can be really useful when performing legal research because it lets you browse through all of the topics that are covered by a part, subpart, chapter, or subchapter. Another benefit of Cornell's site is that it contains a note tab and a link to related regulations in the CFR, which you find under the Authorities CFR tab. So if you click the Note tab, you'll learn more about the statute. This is usually where you can find a statute's short title, which is basically its popular name. Now, the Notes section can be lengthy, so what I usually do is a keyword search, Control F, for the phrase short title. So here you'll see that the 1990 amendment to the Clean Air Act is usually known as the Clean Air Act Amendments of 1990. Okay, that's great. That seems to make sense. But then take a look at the 1998 amendment. It's not known as the 1998 amendment. It is known as the Border Smog Reduction Act of 1998. So keep in mind that as statutes get amended over time, each amendment might have its own short title. And if several public laws get incorporated into a single statute, each public law will have its own name, which may or may not be specifically called out as a short title in the notes section. But anyway, the notes section does just give you good information about a particular section within the US Code, and it does include the public law number. So if you want to read the entirety of it, you can just click on that public law number. If you want to know which regulations in the CFR are authorized by a specific statute or section of a statute, that's where you click the Authorities CFR tab. And you'll get a list of all of the parts within the Code of Federal Regulations that are impacted by this particular section of the Clean Air Act, 42 U.S.C. Section 7401. So it's just a really good way to go back and forth and see the link between the U.S. Code, the statute, and the CFR, the regulations that came from that statute. Okay, so here is another legal research exercise, this one for federal statutes. Again, I strongly recommend that you either pause the lecture and work through this now, or use the slides to work through it later, and go to the week 3 ungraded discussion board if you need assistance. And again, as I noted in part 1 of the lecture, these exercises are not specific to environmental law. They're not specific to all hazards management. I just want you to practice the process of legal research. So in this case, I want you to use Cornell's popular name table to find the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. I want you to find the citation for that statute. I want you to find what year it was signed into law and which section is about school improvement. If you are looking for state laws, then you're obviously not going to be looking in the US Code. You'll have to find the state's official compilation of its statutes. Citation format is going to vary by state. It's not quite as simple as a US Code citation, but the actual format of the statutes is going to be almost identical to the US Code. Now, your state might call its official compilation a code, an annotated code, statutes, or revised statutes. Maryland's official compilation of statutes is the Maryland Code Annotated. Same for Washington, D.C., that's the D.C. Code Annotated, whereas Colorado calls its version the Colorado Revised Statutes. Some states also subdivide their codes by subject matter, much like a title of the US Code. So, for instance, California has the California Family Code, which is separate from the California Fish and Game Code. Whatever citation the state uses is the official citation. Now, you can find state statutes in a variety of different places. You can find them on Cornell. If you click on a topic like agriculture, it'll actually bring up the appropriate title from each state code. You can also find a full listing of state statutes. Mitchie's LexisNexis is what I recommend. It is free if a state uses it to house the state's official compilation of statutes. Also, you can go to the landing page of a state's website like colorado.gov. It will probably include a link to the statutes. If not, you can go to the state legislature's website, and then you can also just Google it. If you do a Google search for Colorado statutes, Google is going to give you a link to the Colorado Revised Statutes. And here they are. Colorado Revised Statutes, organized by title, looks very much like the US Code. Now remember to expand your sections so that you can browse topics. If you are looking for Colorado's emergency management statutes, you will see that it is in Title 24, State Government. You expand Principal Departments. You will see that Article 33.5 is Public Safety. And then Part 7 is Emergency Management. And in Part 7, you are going to find all of the various sections that relate to emergency management, including Section 705.3, which is the statewide all hazards resource database. So here is a specific section of the Colorado statute. Notice here that there are also breadcrumbs available, so you can see exactly how you got here to Section 705.3. You'll also see the official Colorado Revised Statute citation there, highlighted in a red box. Okay, moving on to regulations, specifically federal regulations right now. These are like statutes, but they're created by federal agencies. They carry the full force of law, so when we talk about the law in our class, we are referring to statutes and regulations and also case law. Now, as we will discuss next week, the public has to be notified if an agency wants to issue a regulation, and the public must be given an opportunity to comment on the regulation. The public is notified about this via the daily Federal Register or by going to regulations.gov, which will also provide you with the Federal Register citation. Now again, because it's published daily, if you're going to cite to the Federal Register, you have to include the volume, page number, and the actual date of the issue. Final federal regulations are compiled and codified in the CFR, which operates much like the US Code. Again, that's the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. The titles represent the broad subject matter categories, and those are further divided into chapters, parts, and sections. For the CFR, the official citation is going to be your title number, CFR, and section number. Okay, so where do you find federal regulations? So the proposed regulations have to be published in the Federal Register. Some years ago, the federal government created regulations.gov, which mirrors information published in the Federal Register, but it also allows you to search and browse very easily, and it lets you submit comments on proposed regulations. Now, if you need to cite to a proposed regulation in your memos, you've got to cite to the Federal Register, but fortunately, regulations.gov will provide you with that official Federal Register citation. Now, if you're using regulations.gov, be aware that you may need to use your agency's commonly known abbreviation or acronym, such as searching for EPA rather than Environmental Protection Agency. If you search by the abbreviation and come up empty-handed, search again with the full name of the agency and vice versa. For both regulations.gov and the Federal Register, remember that your search defaults to the present day. So if you are looking for a proposed regulation that was issued yesterday, you're not going to find it in the default search because it's just looking for today. You're going to need to expand the date range of your search. Final regulations get published in the CFR. That is available on Cornell's website and also from the GPO. Like I mentioned before, the GPO actually provides two options, the regular CFR and then the eCFR, which is updated more regularly. Usually the ECFR is updated daily on regular workdays. It's behind right now because of the government shutdown, but a nice thing about the ECFR is that it actually tells you at the very top of the page the date through which it is current. And so the GPO provides the ECFR because so many regulations are issued each year that regulated parties cannot wait for that annual compilation of the CFR. It's also kind of onerous to make regulated parties read through pages and pages of the Federal Register to figure out, where there are new regulations that they've got to comply with. And so that's why we've got the ECFR as well. So here are federal regulations, the final form, the CFR, on Cornell's website. And as with the US Code, I find that Cornell's website is the best and most user-friendly place to find CFR regulations. So again, the CFR is organized into titles. Those titles cover broad subject matter areas, and then they are broken down into finer and more distinct topics. So Title 7 of the CFR is agriculture, and then you can see that that's got subtitle A and subtitle B, and you can see that those subtitles break down into parts and chapters as well. So that's just if you want to browse the CFR. Now remember, a nice thing about Cornell's site is that the US Code Authorities tab links to the CFR and vice versa. So if you are looking for school lunch program regulations, and then you wonder what statute provided the authority for those regulations, just look for the authority heading or tab. So here, I've got it highlighted, and then I've got the inset. That's the statute 42 USC section 1751 that authorizes the USDA to issue regulations about the National School Lunch Program. And those regulations, you see on the main picture here, are 7 CFR Part 210, National School Lunch Program. So you can very easily figure out what statute authorized the regulations, or from the statute itself, you can click that Authority CFR tab and be taken directly to the regulations. So that's what I really like about Cornell's site. State regulations, they are usually set up in a fashion similar to the CFR, but the best way to find them is to just do a Google search. So here I searched for Colorado regulations, and Google sent me to the Code of Colorado Regulations, housed on the Colorado Secretary of State's website. And if you were to scroll down, you will see the Department of Public Safety. They're in 1507. And then further, you will see the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. So if you click that, then you get to the regulations, Colorado regulations that apply to emergency management. Now, I will say that there is much less consistency in the ways that states organize their regulations. Personally, I don't think that Colorado or Maryland, which are the states in which I do most of my legal research, neither of them do a particularly great job with their online regulations, but it is still easier than having to go to a law library. So like I said earlier, proposed federal regulations have to be published in the Federal Register, but they are also available on regulations.gov. I think it's really worth just kind of poking around regulations.gov. It's not always the most intuitive interface, but it does provide a wealth of information on proposed regulations, and the more you use it, of course, the more you get used to it. So here you can see that I have clicked that Browse tab, and it is showing me featured regulations. These are the regulations that agencies expect are going to receive the most comments. but you should never assume that an important proposed regulation is going to be included on the featured list. You might have to actually go search or browse to it. So you can browse regulations.gov by agency. Just start typing in the agency's name or abbreviation, and it'll come up. You can also scroll through the entire list of agencies, which is organized by cabinet department. So here on the left side of the screen, I decided to search for proposed regulations, which regulations.gov calls rules, even though it doesn't call itself rules.gov. But I was looking for proposed regulations from the USDA. So I didn't really bother to narrow my search. At the top right, you'll see that I found 45 results that matched my search for just any type of USDA proposed rules. I scrolled down a little bit to get to the one about ethical conduct, because that's what I thought was interesting. So if I want to take a look at the USDA's ethical standards, I can click on the docket folder. So that's highlighted in red on the top right. You can see it says open docket folder. So that's going to open up the docket, which is shown at the bottom right of the screen. And from there, I can see the entire docket. So any proposed format of the rule, primary documents related to it, as well as public comments submitted in response to the proposed regulation. So if you can see on this slide at the bottom right, that second commenter is clearly not happy with the USDA. So keep in mind that only the first 2 lines of comments show on this screen. You've got to click on the comments to see the whole thing. So I can also see that in this case, the regulation is still a proposed rule rather than a final one. So there I'm looking at the regulatory timeline. That's on the picture at the bottom right, on the right-hand side in the middle. I can also see the name and contact information of the USDA official responsible for the regulation, which is great because if I've got questions, now I've also got somebody to ask. So the Federal Register is the other place that you can find proposed rules. Again, keep in mind, the Federal Register is published daily. So you can see on the slide here that I grabbed this screenshot on Friday, January 31st. You might need to expand your search to just cover a wider range of dates because the default will likely be the day that you are actually searching. So you can browse the Federal Register for proposed regulations, newly issued final regulations, and other administrative documents. So you can also search it, and you can narrow your search type. So if you look in the search box here, you can see that I'm searching for EPA documents. If I were to click on the PR circle, then I have limited that search to proposed rules only. So if I want to search the Federal Register for regulations about the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, I can just go ahead and search for SNAP. You'll see that on the left side of the screen. I can limit that search to the USDA's rules or proposed rules, and the search results let me know that the USDA has issued 58 documents about SNAP proposed rules, one of which was issued in the last 30 days. I can scroll down and review all of those documents. They are default sorted by relevance, but you can go ahead and also sort by date. Simply click the newest or oldest. You can also browse the Federal Register. Browsing by agency will give you a quick snapshot of the number of proposed regulations as issued by cabinet-level departments and the number of comments received on those proposed regulations. You can then, of course, browse deeper to get to various agencies within a cabinet department. You can find a lot of different information on the Federal Register's website. So again, I say take some time to just browse around it and see what's available. Okay, here is another one of our legal research exercises. This one deals with both a statute and the regulations that it authorizes. So I want you to find a statute in the US Code that deals with flammable fabrics. I would just go ahead and use the popular name table, go over to F and do a keyword search for flammable and see what comes up. I want you to find the US Code citation for this law, also the Statutes at Large citation, and I want you to find the US Code's definition of fabric for this particular law and provide the citation for that definition. Then, once you've found it in the US Code, I want you to take a look at related CFR provisions and find out what title and part of the CFR provides standards for the flammability of clothing textiles. So go ahead and work through that exercise. Okay, now we're going to turn to case law. I promise we're getting close to the end. Case law, that's going to be our final major primary source for legal research. Case law is composed of various judicial opinions that interpret constitutions, prior cases, statutes, and regulations. As I noted before, case law is compiled into volumes that are called reporters. Only a very tiny fraction of cases that are decided in the US are actually published in reporters. And that's because many cases don't have any precedential value. So for instance, if Tony Stark sues Captain America because Cap damaged Tony's Iron Man suit, and the court rules that Cap owes Tony a new suit, that's fine for Tony and for Captain America, but it doesn't really have any real meaning for the rest of us. So that decision's not going to be published. However, if the Supreme Court rules that Captain America's actions are constrained by the US Constitution and Bill of Rights, well, that does have an impact on the general public, because if Cap busts into your apartment without a warrant, nothing he finds can be used against you in a court of law. Similarly, if Congress were to pass a law that makes superheroes financially liable for property damage that they cause, that's meaningful to the general public. So the next time Tony's Iron Man suit malfunctions and crashes through your roof, you know that you can sue Tony under the Federal Superhero Property Damage Liability Act, and Tony's going to have to be responsible for paying for your new roof. And when courts interpret that act, that's meaningful for all of us. So the main federal court reporters are the United States Reports, which is the official reporter for the US Supreme Court decisions, and the Federal Reporter, which is the official reporter for federal circuit court decisions. Circuit courts, again, also known as our federal courts of appeals. Because Supreme Court and circuit court rulings set legal precedents in their jurisdictions, the whole of the United States for the Supreme Court and large sections of the country for courts of appeals, those decisions are worth publishing. There are other official reporters, including the Federal Supplement, which publishes some federal district court opinions, although not a lot of them, because district courts are trial courts, and their outcome is much more important to the parties involved than to the rest of us. There are also unofficial reporters. The Atlantic and the Pacific reporters will publish state Supreme Court decisions and possibly some really important state Court of Appeals decisions. Then there are reporters like the Supreme Court Reporter and the Supreme Court Lawyers Edition, which normally we just call the Lawyers Edition. These mirror the official US reports, but they are not the official reporter. Now, the Lawyers Edition is great for case law research because it's got a lot of annotations and headnotes, and headnotes help attorneys perform legal research by basically providing a list of related topics and cases. You will see headnotes on a variety of websites. They are not just limited to the Lawyers Edition. In any event, when you cite to a court case, you need to include the name of the case, the volume and name of the official court reporter, and the page number where the case starts. If it's a Supreme Court decision, you just need to also put in the year the decision was issued, because we all know that the US reports is for the Supreme Court. Otherwise, you need to include the name of the court. So for instance, like I had here, I've got the Fourth Circuit decided a case in 2001. It was published as 440 F3D 625. So volume 440 of the Federal Reporter 3rd edition, and that case starts on page 625. Okay, so where to find case law? Regrettably, Nexus Uni is actually one of the most accurate methods of retrieving case law. Google's also quite good at it. When you're citing case law, a lot of people cite to find law. Don't do that. Don't cite to find law, don't cite to Lexis. Those are not official court reporters. The official citation will be available on find law and Lexis, but don't ever cite to them. So you can search for case law on Nexus Uni. If you go to Nexus Uni Home, click the drop-down menu near all Nexus Uni, it's going to bring up content collection, and from there you can choose cases. Alternately, from the Nexus Uni home screen, if you see the guided search, you can click cases, then it will allow you to select federal or state cases, and if you select state cases, you can further narrow that by state. From the Nexus Uni homepage, you can use the guided search and select cases and then federal cases, or you can just start typing the case name. So here I used the guided search, and as soon as I typed the first part of Brown v. Board of Ed, results popped up. I know that I was looking for a Supreme Court case, so the first citation in the list looks appropriate because it is from US Reports. So I clicked on that result. I click on that, and it brings up the Supreme Court opinion for Brown v. Board of Ed. If I scroll down on this page, I'll see headnotes, and then the case summary, which is called a syllabus, and then finally the actual opinion. You also see that little yellow triangle. So sometimes cases get overturned. That happens much more frequently at the district court and circuit court levels, but the Supreme Court will overturn its past opinions sometimes. When a case has any type of negative treatment, you're going to get that little marker in the form of a yellow triangle or a red octagon next to the case name. So here, for Brown v. Board of Ed, you see a yellow triangle. And then if you look over to the right in that box called Shepard's, you'll see that it is advising caution. What that means is that one or more subsequent cases, cases decided after Brown v. Board of Education, the majority opinion of Brown has received some type of negative treatment. Oftentimes, it is just cited in a dissenting opinion, and you can ignore it. Other times, a portion of the case might be called into question or overturned. If a case is overturned, you're going to see that red octagon. It looks like a stop sign. If called into question, you will see an orange question mark. So now, why is it called Shepard's? Shepard Citations was a service that was started by Frank Shepard in the late 1800s. It remains the most popular citation service for legal research. And what Shepard's does is it lets you know how the case you're reading has been treated after it was decided. So Shepard's provides a list of all of the authorities that cite a particular case. Normally what this means is subsequent cases, but it could also include statutes. Because sometimes Congress disagrees with a court decision and it creates a law, a statute, that invalidates the court decision. Now, if it is a US Supreme Court decision on a constitutional issue, it can't be so easily modified by Congress. We would actually have to have a constitutional amendment or a subsequent Supreme Court case that would modify it. So here is an example of an overturned case. Plessy v. Ferguson which found that white and black Americans could have separate but equal accommodations, such as railway cars, schools, and water fountains. You see here that there is that red octagon, which is a warning that this case is no longer good law. If you click Reason for Shepard's Signal, look at the top right there, I've got that in a red box, you'll get a pop-up box that lets you know that Plessy v. Ferguson was overruled by Brown v. Board of Education. So earlier, when the Supreme Court decided Plessy, it said, yeah, separate but equals fine. And then the Supreme Court changed its mind and in Brown versus Board of Ed said, no, separate but equal violates the Constitution. We are overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. If you were to click Shepardize this document, you can see that under the Shepards heading on the right-hand side of the screen under all of the different citing decisions. You will get the entire history of decisions that reference Plessy v. Ferguson. Shepardize has become a verb that refers to the process of consulting shepherds to see if a case has been overturned or reaffirmed or questioned or even just cited by later cases. Okay, let's go back to Brown versus Board of Education. From that decision, I clicked Shepardize this document, and the screen that you're seeing is the result that I got. So as you can see, 53 subsequent court cases have distinguished the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. One court case limited it, although that was done by a district court, which is the lowest level of federal courts, and one case criticized the Brown v. Board of Ed ruling. However, 136 subsequent cases followed the holding from Brown because it is still good law. 440 subsequent cases mentioned it in some type of neutral manner, and over 2,500 subsequent cases cited it for some reason or other. As non-attorneys, I don't expect you to worry about Shepardizing cases. All I want you to do is be aware that the Shepard citation will let you know if a case is still good law. So if you want to use a court case to make an argument, you just need to make sure that it has not been overturned. Now, Cornell, their website is okay if you want to find historic cases. So here, again, I'm looking for Brown v. Board of Ed. I know it's a Supreme Court decision, so I click that. If I scroll all the way down, you can see that there's a historic. So if I were to click that, I would bring up all of the historic Supreme Court cases, and then I can select a topic. If I select the topic of segregation, I will see first Plessy v. Ferguson, and then I will see Brown v. Board of Education. Now, I like Cornell's site for reading cases, but it's not always that great for searching for cases. Fortunately, if you do a regular Google search, it will most likely bring up the case on Cornell's site. But here's an example of actually searching Cornell's site. I decided to search for Obergefell v. Hodges, the case that made same-sex marriage legal throughout the United States. In this case, I'm lucky because Obergefell is a weird name, and so the case that I want is right at the top of the search result list. But because Cornell's case law search isn't that great, and Nexus Uni is terribly painful, I recommend just using a regular Google search. This is one of the few times for scholarly research where regular Google is actually better than Google Scholar. So you can see that I just went to Google and I searched for 347 US 483. That's the citation for Brown versus Board of Education. Google's results provide a link to the case on Cornell's site. So although it can be difficult to use Cornell Site to search for a case, it's great for reading a case. So if I click on Brown v. Board of Ed for Cornell LII, and I've got that highlighted in a red box there, Google will automatically take me to the decision and syllabus for the case. You'll see here under Brown v. Board of Ed, I have highlighted the decision tab, and I've also highlighted the syllabus and opinion. The syllabus is a summary of the case, and I highly recommend reading it before you read the case itself. Sometimes, honestly, you don't even have to read the case itself because the syllabus is going to tell you everything that you need to know. If you scroll down past the syllabus, you will come to the opinion. You can also take a shortcut by just clicking the hyperlink for the opinion. Here you'll also see that the opinion for Brown v. Board of Ed was written by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Even though Justice Warren was appointed by a Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, the Warren Court actually presided over a substantial shift in American jurisprudence. Many of the rights that we take for granted today that have become really ingrained in our culture, like the right to remain silent when being questioned by police, and our right to have an attorney in court, and our right to privacy, those rights were given to us by the Warren Court when it interpreted the Constitution. So if you are reviewing case law, you're going to have to know how to cite to the specific page in the official reporter. Cornell's website provides correct page numbers for the case as it is printed in the U.S. reports or another official reporter like the Federal Reporter. So if you were to go to a law library and you picked up the hard copy of volume 347 of U.S. reports and you turn to page 486, you're going to see the start of the opinion in the case of Brown versus Board of Ed. If you want to quote language from a court opinion, you need to cite to the correct page number in U.S. reports if it's a Supreme Court case. So for example, let's say you want to quote the court using the so-called separate but equal doctrine. You need to cite to page 488 because that's where it is in the official U.S. reports. So your full citation would be 347 U.S. 483, 488, because that lets you know the page on which the case starts and then the page where you are pulling your quote from. You could do a short cite, which is just 347 U.S. at 488. So just take a look at this screen. You can understand, the asterisk means this is where the opinion starts, and then the bolded page numbers are the pages from the U.S. reports from the official paper version. Cornell's website does not include page numbers for any unofficial reporters, such as the Supreme Court Reporter or the Lawyer's Edition. Nexus Uni does include unofficial reporters. So you can see here, Brown v. Board of Ed, the official reporter is always going to be listed first. So you see there 347 U.S. 483 and then an asterisk. You can also see the citations to all of the unofficial reporters like Supreme Court Reports, Lawyer's Edition, and the Lexis Citation. Just ignore all of those. All you need is the official U.S. report citation. So again, when referring to a court opinion, particularly when you are quoting from one, you need to cite to the page number where that idea or quotation resides in the official reporter. So here, Nexus Uni is letting you know that a single asterisk denotes the U.S. reports. That's the official reporter. It also lets you know that it's giving you the page numbers from other reporters which are designated by multiple asterisks. I say just ignore everything with more than one asterisk. Just skip right over it when you're reading. Don't let it interfere with your flow. All you need is the official citation for the US reports. So, you are going to have to submit 2 graded case briefs in this course. So that is the number one reason why you need to bother with briefing a case. But case briefs are also a way of making sure that you truly understand the court ruling and that you're boiling it down to its essential components. So many court cases, I would say the vast majority of court cases, are lengthy, they're dense, and they're detailed. And you probably don't need to know all of those details. You just need to know the basic facts, the question before the court, which is known as a question of law, and the court's ruling, also known as a holding. If you want to or you need to become an expert in a particular field of jurisprudence, such as Clean Air Act case law, briefing cases is going to help you learn how to effectively read, interpret, and summarize judicial opinions. So think of case briefs as the flashcards of the legal world. Because of this, case briefs must be brief, no more than one single-spaced page. They should be written in plain English in your own words, with the very rare exception of truly important quotations. And I am talking about quotations that are worthy of historical note that are going to be engraved on some government building somewhere. If it's not a truly amazing, groundbreaking quotation, put it in your own words. Case briefs are also going to be 4 sections. Now keep in mind, a case brief is like a flashcard. It is not the same thing as a legal brief or an amicus brief submitted by attorneys to courts with respect to specific cases. Okay, so again, 1 page. A case brief should never ever exceed 1 single-spaced page. This means that you need to find only the very most important parts of a court opinion. Your facts and your rationale sections are going to be the longest parts of the case brief. Your question of law and your holding are going to be the shortest. The facts section needs to provide a quick rundown of the essential, relevant facts. Law students sometimes are required to provide a procedural history of how the case got to the court that's issuing the opinion, but you do not need to do that. It takes up precious space. It doesn't provide you with much meaning. Honestly, you don't even need to include names, usually because the point of a case brief is to assist you in learning jurisprudence, not learning the individual players in each and every case. The whole point of case law is that it is generalizable and it is applicable to any person or any entity's conduct after the court issued its ruling. So don't get bogged down in the facts, just find what's really essential to understand why the court ruled the way that it did. Your question of law, which is also called an issue of law, that section should be a single question, again in plain English, that can be answered with yes or no. You want to find the Goldilocks zone for your question of law, and that can take some practice. You don't want the question to be too general or too vague, because you need to show that you understand the question before the court, and the case brief needs to be helpful to you later because, again, it's like a flashcard. So you can see here that I have provided a couple of different questions of law, all for the same case. The first one is too vague. Was the police officer's action unconstitutional? Well, that might be what the court's ruling on, but that's going to be utterly useless to you later down the line when you look at your case brief. because it doesn't give you enough information. Too complicated is a lengthy question with lots of commas that just goes on and on and on. So you can read that. I'm not going to read it to you. Just right is what you're going for. And in this case, that would be, does the Fifth Amendment require the government to notify arrested or detained individuals of their constitutional rights against self-incrimination and their right to an attorney before interrogating them? That will be useful to you later because as you're looking through your case brief, you know exactly what this case is about. You know that it's a Fifth Amendment case. You know that it's a criminal law case. And you know that it deals with constitutional rights against self-incrimination and your right to an attorney. So that is the Goldilocks zone of just right for your question of law. Your holding section, that should be a single sentence that answers your question of law. It should start with a yes or no. And then your rationale section explains why the court ruled as it did. Much like in the facts section, for the rationale, you need to find only the most important parts of the majority decision, and you need to write them out in plain English. So here is an example of a case brief. This is Miranda versus Arizona, which is the case that gave us our right to remain silent, right to an attorney, all of those Miranda warnings that you hear a lot when you're watching like Law and Order or something. So for the case brief, you will see that I've included the name of the case, Miranda v. Arizona, and its full official citation, 384 U.S. 436, 1966. Again, I don't need to include the name of the court that decided it because I can see that it's U.S. reports and that only covers Supreme Court cases. Then in the facts section, I have written out the most essential facts of the case. This is actually a pretty complicated case. It was 4 different cases that got combined, but you'll see that I don't have any of that here because it's not that important. I just need to know the basic facts, which is that Miranda was arrested by the police. They didn't tell him he could remain silent. They didn't tell him he could have counsel present. And after they interrogated him for a few hours, he made incriminating statements, and those statements were used against him later at trial. And so he was found guilty, in this case of rape and kidnapping. Then I wrote the question of law in plain English. You can see it's the same one kind of that I had before. Does the Fifth Amendment require the government to notify arrested or detained individuals of their constitutional rights against self-incrimination and their right to an attorney before interrogating them? That can be answered yes or no. And in my holding section, I answered starting with yes, and then I gave just a really brief sentence for the holding. It's just plainly stated. Yes, the government has to inform individuals of their Fifth Amendment constitutional right against self-incrimination and their right to an attorney before they interrogate them. Then I've got the rationale section. And again, this is usually the most difficult part to write because you're distilling a whole bunch of pages of the court's decision into like a paragraph or 2. But doing that, make sure that you really understand why the court ruled the way it did. Briefing cases also lets you practice translating dense legal jargon into plain English, which is really crucial when dealing with the public, and honestly is quite helpful when writing memos to your boss, because the shorter the memo, the more chance it is that somebody's actually going to read it. So this is a sample of a case brief. Take a look at it. Use it to guide you when you are writing your case briefs. Okay, finally, I want to very briefly discuss agency decisions. We talked about Comptroller General decisions before. They are very meaningful for government contractors. But most agencies have administrative law judges, or ALJs, and they preside over administrative hearings. And we're going to cover a lot of this later in the course. But the Administrative Procedure Act requires that ALJs provide written opinions that include findings of fact and conclusions of law, much like a judicial opinion. And unless they are overturned by a court case, a subsequent statute, or a subsequent regulation, agency decisions set precedents for the agency, but only for that agency. They have no precedential value for other agencies. That means that other agencies don't have to follow the decision. You can, however, still use an agency decision to try to make a point. So for instance, if you disagree with an FDA regulation and the USDA has issued an opinion on a somewhat similar USDA regulation, you can try to persuade the FDA administrative law judge to adopt the USDA administrative law judge's reasoning, but they don't have to. The most commonly used administrative decisions are Comptroller General decisions and Board of Contract Appeals decisions. There are also some agencies, such as the Department of Interior, that have their own internal Board of Contract Appeals and then other decision-making authorities. So Interior, for instance, has land appeals decisions, and it also has Indian appeals decisions, in addition to contract appeals decisions and what they call solicitors' opinions, which are related to appeals from Department of Interior administrative decisions and director's orders. Agency citation formats are not always uniform, and they're not always easy to find the repository, so your best bet is to just Google a specific agency's decisions and then take a look at the agency website that describes its administrative decisions. So if you need to find an EPA decision, just Google EPA decisions and you'll probably be taken to the right site. And then often you can search within those websites. Well, congratulations, you have made it through the lecture on legal research. So due this week, we've got your first case brief. You are going to be briefing the case of Petpo versus U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Please keep in mind this needs to be 1 page, single-spaced, 4 sections, and you need to write it in your own words. So no quoting, no legalese, just plain English that comes from you, because that's the way that you make sure that you understand what the case is about and how the court ruled. If you've got questions about your case brief, just go ahead and shoot me an email, or you can post it in our Q&A discussion board, because if you got questions, then it's likely that other people in class do as well. So thank you for listening. Please do use these slides as your sort of legal research guide that can help you out as you're going through this, this semester in our course. And then if you've got questions, let me know. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you on the discussion boards.